According to United Nations projections, India's population has equaled or even exceeded China's. In 2022, India's economic aggregate has surpassed the United Kingdom and become the world's fifth largest economy. Can India, the world's most populous country, take advantage of its scale to replicate an economic miracle like China's in the future? What is the demographic dividend window period? According to the definition of economics, demographic dividend refers to the economic growth effect that comes with the increase in the proportion of the working population in the total population. The demographic dividend often occurs during the demographic transition period when the fertility rate has just begun to decline. When the proportion of children, the elderly, especially children, decreases, and the proportion of the young and middle-aged working population is less than 50%, it means that a window of opportunity may come. In recent years, the number and proportion of India's elderly population has slowly increased, the proportion of children under 15 years of age has been declining, and the number and proportion of the working age population has continued to expand. Since 2019, India's total dependency ratio has been below 50% for the first time and continues to decline. The 2021 data shows that it is 48.1%, of which the elderly dependency ratio reaches 10.1% and the child dependency ratio is 38.1%. The reduction in the population support burden is due to the decline in the fertility rate, which was originally at a high level. According to India's National Health Data Assessment, the total fertility rate has dropped from 3.4 in 1992 to 1993 to 2.0 in 2019 to 2021. This fertility rate is slightly lower than the population's fertility level, 2.1. India's current population is still very young, as fertility rates are just beginning to decline. More than half of India's population, 52%, is under the age of 30, 27% is under the age of 15, and 12% is over 60, accounting for less than 1/8. The median age of the population is 28.4 years old, which is 10 years younger than China's median age of 38.8 years. If we use dependency ratio data as a benchmark, India is roughly equivalent to China's level around 1996. In 1996, China's dependency ratio began to be less than 50%, 49.6%, and has continued to decline since then. By the time it joined the WTO in 2001, the dependency ratio had dropped to 44.7%. The labor force reached 800 million in 1995, exceeded 900 million in 2002, crossed 1 billion in 2011, and peaked at 1.006 billion in 2013. According to 2021 data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, India's labor force exceeds 900 million. The Indian government predicts that the labor force will exceed 1 billion in the next 10 years. India's labor force participation rate is too low. India has a large population and a young age structure, which is similar to China in the early stages of reform and opening up. However, there is one big difference from China, and that is the low labor participation rate. According to the Indian Economic Monitoring Center, India's labor participation rate will be only 49.5% in 2022, which means that more than half of the population has withdrawn from the labor market. This number is far lower than when China's demographic dividend started, and it is also lower than the current Chinese labor force participation rate. The labor force participation rate of Indian women is even more disastrous, and the gap with China is even wider. From 1990 to 2006, at least 27% of India's working-age women entered the labor force. However, after India transformed from a low-income country to a lower-middle-income country in 2012, women's labor force participation rate continued to decline and has not recovered. By 2022, World Bank data shows that India's female labor force participation rate is 22%, compared with 58% in China. The data monitored by India itself is even bleaker. According to the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, about 12% of working-age women were working or wanted to work in February 2020, but by October 2022, this proportion had dropped to just 10%. In some northern regions and the Hindi belt, women's labor force participation rate is even in single digits. This means that more than 90% of women drop out of the labor force entirely. In addition to women, male labor force participation rates are also declining. From February 2020 to October 2022, India's male working population increased by 46 million. If the labor force participation rate remained constant, an additional 33 million men would be looking for work. Instead, the number increased by only 1.3 million. In fact, nearly 32 million working-age men have dropped out of the labor force. How can we reap the demographic dividend and develop the economy when the labor force participation rate is so low? This is a very serious problem for India. Not enough manufacturing jobs. So why is India's labor force participation rate declining? In terms of GDP numbers, the Indian economy looks good. India's GDP growth rate continued to rise from 2011 to 2016, reaching 8.26% in 2016. Although it declined later, it will see a growth rate of 8.68% in 2021, and last year's growth rate was 6.7%. Why is a growing economy not creating enough jobs? This starts with the Indian economic structure. India's economic growth still relies largely on agriculture and the service industry. Data for the fiscal year 2020 to 2021 show that the service industry accounts for nearly 54% of India's GDP, agriculture still accounts for 20% of India's GDP, and industry accounts for 25.9%. Among them, the manufacturing industry that can absorb the most labor only accounts for 14.4%. The Indian government proposed the Made in India goal in 2014, including an average annual manufacturing output growth of 12% to 14%, an additional 100 million manufacturing jobs, and the contribution of manufacturing to gross domestic product, GDP, in 2020 reached 25%. But in fact, the proportion of India's manufacturing industry in GDP has been declining since 2015, accounting for only 14% in 2021. As a result, employment in India's manufacturing sector has remained stagnant over the past decade. Between 2011 to 2012 and 2018 to 2019, manufacturing employment fell by 3.3 million. After 2019, manufacturing employment rebounded, but has not yet returned to 2011 levels. At the same time, the number of agricultural employment began to rise, with 2.5 million people engaged in agriculture in the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year, an increase of 20% from the 2018 to 2019 fiscal year. The IT service industry accounts for very little. The continued growth of the service industry cannot currently solve the problem of low labor participation rate. India's service industry accounts for more than half of GDP, but only provides 32.3% of employment capacity. Traditional services such as wholesale and retail trade, transportation, public administration, and defense still account for the majority of services employment, about 50%. These jobs pay low wages and involve physical labor. The proportion of undernourished people in India is still as high as 16%, and these industries cannot absorb women into the labor market. The IT technology outsourcing business in India that we often hear about actually accounts for a very small proportion of the overall service industry, only 1.7% in 2019, which is insignificant when compared to the entire employed population. Increased employment in modern services requires higher levels of education and skills. The education level in India is generally low, which may result in some people not having enough skills to participate in the labor market. According to OECD data, 77.6% of India's labor force has not completed high school education, 12.9% has junior college and higher education, and the lowest proportion is 9.4% who have completed high school education. Low labor productivity. The demographic dividend is not only related to the labor participation rate, but also affected by labor productivity. And this is also a problem for India. In 2021, India's labor productivity per unit of employment was $6,688, while China's labor productivity per unit of employment was $16,512, priced in constant 2010 US dollars. In other words, the value that each employed worker in China can produce is 2.5 times that of India. At the same time, India's labor productivity is improving at a slower pace. From 2011 to 2021, China's labor productivity average annual growth rate was 6.7%, while India's growth rate was 5.1% during the same period. If labor productivity cannot be improved, even if the labor participation rate improves, it will be difficult to achieve the effective promotion of economic development by the demographic dividend. Husikwan and Mating, Experts from the Economic Forecasting Department of the National Information Center mentioned in the research and analysis of India's demographic dividend, affected by multiple factors such as industrial structure, comprehensive quality of the population, social culture, and gender discrimination, India will most likely miss out on the demographic dividend. During the dividend window period, there is no population but no dividends. For India, unless it can truly improve the quality of its population and find a driving force for economic transformation, the window of population opportunity may not be a demographic dividend, but a demographic disaster, let alone being able to replicate the growth miracle of the next China.